Greetings, Covenant family in the Pacific Northwest. This is Jill Riley, the Assistant Communications person, and I am coming to you live from Seattle instead of cold Montana. I'm excited today to have Jelani Greenidge with us, and we are going to be talking about his ministry and kind of his journey with using words to tell the gospel story.
Jelani is the worship pastor for Access Covenant in Portland, Oregon, and he is also the missional storyteller for the Evangelical Covenant Church, mainly through the Covenant Companion. But we are here to talk about mostly his book that has just been released through Whipfenstock Publishers called Undercover Prophets, Pursuing Stand-Up Comedy to talk about what matters most. So, Jelani, welcome. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your background that led up to this book about stand-up comedy.
I have a performing background. I come from a very musical family. Those who are familiar with my family know we've been, I grew up singing gospel music and doing
Yes.
gospel concerts and things like that. And then that sort of paved the way for, as a young adult, I began leading worship in the church. First in my dad's church, what was known at the time as Irvington Covenant. Now it's Peak Cove. Shout out to Portland Covenant. And then, a bunch of other different covenant churches. And I started experimenting with hip hop and kind of, being very known for that sort of expressive thing. And then about 10 years ago, a friend of mine who was a pastor invited me to one of his shows. He was like, I'm doing this stand up show. I'm taking a stand up comedy class, and I want you to come, and tickets are free. And I responded with, you could have led with tickets are free. And so I showed up, and I had a good time, and he was pretty funny, but I'm naturally competitive. So I was like, well, I'm funnier than him.
Yeah.
And so I then took the same comedy class and started doing a little bit of stand up kind of on the side. I realized as I was doing it that it was a really valuable ministry opportunity. And in my thought processes around that and my desire to have other people join me on this comedy journey, I wrote this book, Undercover Prophets.
Awesome. So tell me about the difference between expressing yourself through worship and music in a church and expressing yourself through hip hop and expressing yourself through comedy. How do those things intersect for you and how are they different?
I mean, all of them have to do with a certain amount of self-expression and storytelling.
Hmm.
And I think that's probably sort of the main thread that travels through all of those forms. I also grew up the youngest of four siblings,
Hmm.
and so when people sometimes say this and they mean it metaphorically, that I was put on stage as a kid, but that's literally true for me. And so, and
Right.
even before I was put on stage, like at churches and stuff, when we would have big family gatherings, it was not uncommon for the aunties and uncles to take me and some of my younger cousins, be like, okay, go away in this room and come back in an hour with a skit. So it was just, so growing up, we were always encouraged to just perform and think of, weird and crazy things. And hip hop was kind of like my first experience with doing that as a form of ministry.
Okay.
But then what ended up happening was, um, I think as I've gotten older, I started to value comedy more because they're both forms of self-expression,
Hmm.
and there's some storytelling aspect to it. But hip hop is a lot more. It's a lot more aggressive. It's a lot more. There's a lot more physicality, which is why more younger people do it, right? You're
Hmm.
like, throw your hands up, and there's a lot of movement and jumping around and yelling real hard, and yo, it's like this whole vibe. Whereas with comedy, I feel like there's a much wider range of expression that's accepted in comedy, and a much wider uh, breadth of subject matter to
Okay.
discuss. And so, like, as a Christian doing hip hop, it was a challenge, to get, first of all, to get people in the church to even
Accept
accept
that.
hip hop
Yeah.
as a valid form of worship expression. But then on the flip side, it was also true that sometimes when I would be doing it out in the community, or out in some street fair or something, then people would have a hard time reconciling the idea of hip hop culture with faith in Christ, and they had these perceptions of hip hop as a genre that I kind of had to deconstruct as I talked about what it means for us to be doing this form, but for Jesus, but for edification rather than for self glorification. And if
Mhm.
you can learn to help people laugh, across the board, whether or not they're in a similar demographic, whether or not you have the same racial ethnic background, or you're in the same generation, or you come from the same geographical location, like if you can learn to kind of make people laugh,
That's
who
always
are
a
coming
win.
at life, yeah, from different places, then that's super valuable.
What are some of the topics that you're talking about that really matter the most to you?
Really, the reason why I do comedy is because I want to help people experience something that's outside of themselves, maybe think about life from another person's perspective.
Mm,
And I think really
good.
skilled comedians do that well, and people can experience that without realizing that they're experiencing it. So I'll give you an example. So one of my favorite jokes is, I'm just gonna tell it. It takes a little bit of backup, but I talk about how, in corporate environments, I don't like it when people use the term low hanging fruit,
Mm.
and they'll say, like, with this initiative, we need to go after the low hanging fruit. And every time I hear someone say that, I want to be like, have you ever actually spent time picking low hanging fruit? Because it's actually backbreaking labor. I think the expression you're looking for is, with this initiative, we need to go after the eye level snacks in the Walgreens checkout line. Now, now that's a funny joke, right? But so the reason why I tell that joke is because I realize that over time, um, a lot of us who are middle class Americans are disconnected from the processes uh, that involve our food. And so, we just go to the store and we buy food, but we don't think about the person that's picking it, the person that's helping to pack it, the person that's helping to ship it. And oftentimes these roles, are being filled by people in different communities than we're connected to. So
Absolutely.
if there are people who are in migrant communities who are doing this work, they're not necessarily the same people that are coming to see me in a comedy show. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But the reason why I tell that joke is to remind people that the language that we use matters. And to
Mhm.
me, that represents the power of what comedy can do, is it can take you out of your own perspective and into someone else's perspective, but in a way that's not confrontational, right? I'm not shaming anybody. I'm not being like, oh, you're a bad person because you said low hanging fruit. I'm just saying, I don't like it.
Well, Jelani, we're excited to look at this book and to read it, and we will put a link below this. And just one last question for you, and that is, tell us just really in brief what your job as missional storyteller involves with the covenant.
Well, my job as missional storyteller is to tell stories primarily in article form, but I tell stories about covenant people in their faith journeys. And so I tell stories about pastors, I tell stories about congregants, and I tell stories about great victories, and I tell stories about struggles.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today and giving us a little window into your world, and we will look forward to reading your book.